Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I am absolutely delighted to welcome onto the podcast Conor Byrne to discuss Lady Katherine Grey. Conor Byrne is a PhD student researching representations of the executions of 4 British queens in 16th and 17th century sources. He is the author of biographies of Queen Catherine Howard and Lady Katherine Grey, and is currently contributing chapters on topics including Lady Jane Grey, cinematic portrayals of Tudor queenship, Elizabethan succession tracks, and Henry VIII and Elizabeth of York for forthcoming edited collections. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome to the podcast, Conor. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, how are you?
I'm brilliant, thank you. I'm really looking forward
Great.
to today because we
Me
are
too.
discussing Catherine Grey, and she's a really interesting figure, actually. So I'm interested to see what we discuss and what you think of her.
Absolutely.
Firstly, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yes, of course, absolutely. So I'm a historian specialising in early modern history, with a specific focus on Tudor queenship. And as kind of this talk suggests, I'm the author of several books, including most recently Lady Katherine Grey. And I'm also currently a PhD candidate in early modern history, again, kind of specifically focusing on queenship. And I have some other pieces of writing in progress at the minute for some edited collections on different topics, including cinematic portrayals of the Tudors, Elizabethan succession tracks, Lady Jane Grey, and then another piece more recently on Henry VII and Elizabeth of York.
Why did you want to write a book on Catherine?
So I've long been interested by the Grey family. I think Lady Jane in particular, as you know, a lot of people are who are interested in this period. But in more recent years, my interest has really pivoted more towards Catherine, both because of her tragic personal life and also because of her dynastic significance. And in terms of wanting to write a book on her, I think because while her story has been the subject of several books, including, you know, biographies and novels, I felt that her political and dynastic significance as a claimant to the English throne needed to be re-emphasized through doing, you know, extensive archival research, including in particular a sustained analysis of the Elizabethan succession tracts, which discussed Catherine's claim to succeed.
So, obviously, Catherine had a very dynastic significance. Why do you think it's so overlooked that she was so significant of succession?
I mean, I think this is such a topical question, especially with Tracy Borman's new book, which obviously looks at James the Sixth's succession to the English throne, and kind of this almost inevitability that, you know, people kind of associate with James inheriting the English throne, that you know, it was almost predestined and that it was kind of taken for granted in the final years of Elizabeth's reign. But as I discuss in the book, this was far from clear throughout Elizabeth's reign, and I think there was a lot of anxiety among the political elite about who was going to be next in line, especially as it became increasingly clear that Elizabeth was not going to marry and produce an heir. Um, but Catherine did have a lot of support, who felt that she should be recognised as the next heir to the throne. And I think, you know, sometimes it can, as I mentioned, it can be seen as predestined that James was going to succeed. But as the book shows, this was far from being the case. And yeah, hopefully that comes across. So,
Moving back in time to Catherine's early years,
yeah.
when was Catherine born?
So her date of birth is traditionally given as 25th of August 1540, but there may be a degree of uncertainty about this in terms of the surviving source material that we have. Other dates have been given with portraits, for example, that are associated with her. For example, slightly earlier in 1538. But we know, for example, that her elder sister Jane was born in 1536 or 1537. So she must have been born sometime after that, either in the late 1530s or more probably in 1540.
What do we know about Catherine's childhood?
So like her sisters, Catherine spent her childhood at Bradgate Park. As I discuss in the book, it's traditionally given as her as her place of birth, but we don't know this for sure. It's possible that she was born at Dorset House in Westminster, rather than at Bradgate Park. But she is traditionally thought to have been less intellectually gifted than her sister Jane. But we do know that she was tutored in Latin and Greek as well. And her mother, Frances Grey, would have instructed her in the kind of traditional feminine pursuits such as embroidery, sewing, dancing, and music, for example. We also know that Catherine's father was a committed religious reformer, so I think this is likely to have shaped the nature of Catherine's religious education. Um, and as I discussed in the book, the Grey parents are traditionally described as being physically abusive to their daughters, especially towards Jane. But this idea has been increasingly challenged in recent years, and it is something that I do discuss in more detail in the book.
Was it likely at all that they were abusive in that sense?
I think what it comes down to is kind of modern conceptions of child abuse and how these differ from what was seen as normal in the early modern period. I mean, we have this famous anecdote from Jane Grey to Roger Ascham about her parents physically chastising her, and everything that she had to do was perfect. And she was being chastised physically if this was not the case. But it's far from clear that Ascham was using this as evidence that Jane was being physically abused, and I think it can be dangerous to kind of read modern notions of child abuse back into the past. But there is no evidence regarding Catherine and her younger sister Mary of them being physically abused in that sense. Probably also worth saying as well, Jane was when negotiations were taking place for Jane's marriage to Guildford Dudley, she famously did not want to marry him and reportedly had to be beaten by her father in order for her to acquiesce. But there is no kind of sense that her mother was involved in doing this. So there is perhaps some truth in the claim, but as I talk about in the book, there's also quite a lot of uncertainty, especially to do with different ideas about child abuse and things like that.
Of course, I think it's a hard topic, isn't it? Because obviously
Yeah.
in television shows it comes across as
Mm.
Francis is
Yeah.
really abusive, especially in
Yeah.
to Jane Grey. But
Yes.
it is hard, isn't it, to like go, well, is it kind of more like a smack on the back of your hand
Mm.
or that kind of situation? Could you tell us about Catherine's first marriage?
Yes, of course. So Catherine married Henry Herbert, who was the heir to the earldom of Pembroke on 25th of May 1533, which was one of three weddings that took place at Durham House, which was the London residence of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. And on that same day, her sister Jane married Guildford Dudley, who was a younger son of the Duke. And Northumberland's daughter Catherine married Henry Hastings, who was heir to the earldom of Huntingdon. And Jane's marriage in particular has been seen as kind of part of this conspiracy to have her placed on the throne, especially with Guildford being Northumberland's son. But it's far more likely that these three marriages were kind of standard political alliances among the Tudor elite. And as I discussed in the book as well, just turning to Jane's marriage, there is quite a lot of evidence that her parents were not particularly pleased with her marrying Guildford. So that again kind of casts doubt on that theory. But yeah, Catherine was very young when she got married. She was probably only around 12 years old. So it's very likely that the marriage was not consummated kind of during its short period that they were married. So yeah, but yeah, one of three weddings that took place that day.
Why was their marriage annulled?
So it all comes down to Jane Grey's regime spectacularly collapsing in the summer of 1533, sorry, 1553. Um, Catherine had been residing with her husband, but as I mentioned, their marriage probably was not consummated in view of their young ages. But when Mary the First was proclaimed queen, Herbert's father, the Earl of Pembroke, kind of immediately switched sides and changed his support to to Mary, acknowledging her as lawful queen. And I think his decision to have his son's marriage to Catherine was kind of part of this attempt to demonstrate his loyalty to the new queen and avoid any kind of association with the Grey family.
What was life like for Catherine after the execution of her sister?
Yes, I mean that's such an interesting question, because we don't have kind of a first-hand account of her reaction to Jane's execution. Obviously, Jane's execution was followed less than 2 weeks later by her father's, so it was, like a double tragedy for Catherine. And we don't know so much her kind of personal feelings towards either of these. But it is interesting that Jane had written a letter to Catherine on the eve of her execution, warning her not to love the world and offering her hope of eternal salvation. So it's very possible that, assuming that she came into possession of this letter, that she would have treasured it as kind of a keepsake of her sister's memory. But in the aftermath, Catherine's mother, who was had always kind of been very close to Mary the First, joined the Queen at court and served in her privy chamber. And we know that Catherine definitely did as well. There's a bit of a question mark about whether her younger sister also joined or whether she was perhaps seen as too young, but Catherine certainly did. And Catherine seems to have been highly favoured by the new queen. We know that she served in the Privy Chamber, which was a mark of high favour, whereas in Elizabeth's reign, she was actually demoted to the Presence Chamber. So, yeah, it seems to have been a period of high favour for her, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, given that Mary obviously had been the one responsible for executing Catherine's sister and father. So, yeah, slightly surprising, perhaps.
Was it during Mary's reign also that Catherine was recognised as being significant to the dynasty as well?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Obviously, we know that Mary was not particularly pleased about having to recognise her sister Elizabeth as her successor, due to kind of the antipathy between them and the fact that Elizabeth was a Protestant and Mary obviously wanted a Catholic successor. As it became increasingly clear towards the end of Mary's reign that she was not going to produce an heir, there seems to have been a question of recognising Lady Margaret Douglas, who was a niece of Henry VIII's, but from the Scottish line of the family, as Mary's successor. And this seems to have been Mary's preference. But she seems to have been dissuaded from doing this by her councillors, who kind of recognised that it would be probably a similar situation to what had happened in Edward's reign when Jane was recognised and it had resulted in um, civil discord. So I don't think Catherine's significance was recognised as much during Mary's reign, and I do talk about this in the book, but there was a rumour in the kind of the final year of Mary's life that both the Grey sisters were kind of disinherited from the succession because of Jane's conviction for treason. So I don't think there was as much emphasis during Mary's reign as there was during Elizabeth's reign. But mostly, I think, due to the question of religion, the Greys being Protestants and Mary wanting a Catholic successor.
How did Catherine's life at court change once Elizabeth became queen?
Well, as I mentioned, when Elizabeth came to the throne, Catherine was demoted from the Privy Chamber where she had been serving Mary alongside her mother, and she was placed in the Presence Chamber, which effectively signalled that she had lost royal favour, not to the extent that she was obviously sent from court or anything like that, but that she was no longer one of the Queen's favoured confidants as she had been during Mary's reign. And we know that she complained about this to the Count of Feria, who was the imperial ambassador at Elizabeth's court, and she spoke openly of how dissatisfied she was with this, and of the fact that she felt Elizabeth was doing it because she didn't want Catherine to be recognised as presumptive. And the ambassador, which I think is very interesting, the ambassador specifically said that Mary had shown her much favour, whereas Elizabeth bore no goodwill towards her. So her situation rapidly changed, and from her perspective, I think she saw it as very insulting. So.
Why do you have any theories why Elizabeth maybe didn't like Catherine as much?
It's such an interesting question, and I think obviously this has been discussed by other historians that even with what happened with Mary, Queen of Scots' execution, Elizabeth's preference always seems to have been for the Scottish line of the family, ultimately with James the Sixth succeeding her. Although, as I mentioned with Tracy Borman's new book, for example, we don't know to what extent she did recognise him as such formally. But yeah, Elizabeth does seem to have harboured a particular kind of resentment towards the Grey family, and I think it's very speculative. I don't know whether this goes back to what had happened with Jane Grey during the final days of Edward's reign, and whether she had harboured a kind of resentment towards the Greys from that point forwards. But I think she was very much aware of Catherine's dynastic significance and saw her as a threat for that reason. And if word had reached Elizabeth that Catherine was openly complaining of her harsh treatment, then I think this would have kind of further antagonised her. Um, and some historians have speculated that, perhaps she was jealous of Catherine, but I think without kind of direct evidence, it's really hard to say. And I think we do have to kind of speculate about this. So.
Which of Elizabeth's courtiers were kind of saying that Catherine should probably be her heir?
Well, I think it would be probably too much of a simplification to say that Catherine was receiving Protestant support and Mary Queen of Scots was receiving Catholic support, because the issue was much more complex than that, and lines were kind of blurred along religion. And obviously there were other candidates as well who had claims to the throne as well. By the kind of final decade of Elizabeth's reign, some writers were suggesting that there were, 12 or 14 candidates who had a claim to the throne. But we certainly though know that probably her biggest supporter was Sir William Cecil, who was Elizabeth's chief statesman. He was very kind of pro-Catherine and wanted her to succeed, I think, because he was very much aware of the threat presented by Mary, Queen of Scots. And we know that this probably feeds onto a question we'll talk about in a minute, but we know that when she was involved with Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, he specifically kind of warned both parties, especially Catherine, to be kind of more careful in the way they were behaving and to be more circumspect. I think because he was very determined to keep Catherine as a very viable candidate, and he didn't really want anything to be, weakening her claim among other writers. So the writers of the tracts. So he was probably her primary supporter. And then we know that other Protestant MPs, for example, John Hales, wrote in favour of Catherine. So she certainly did have quite a lot of support. And probably interesting as well to say, just going back to the Count of Feria, he seems to have been very interested in Catherine's claim because she gave him some reason to suspect that she was a Catholic, which we know that she probably was not. And he thought that a possible solution to the succession would be for her to marry the son of the King of Spain and essentially bring Catholicism back to England if Elizabeth died childless, with kind of an English-Spanish royal marriage that would restore Catholicism. So yeah, quite an interesting broad base of support for her claim.
How did Catherine come to meet Edward Seymour?
So the couple met during the summer of 1558, which was the final year of Mary the First's reign, and they met at Hanworth, which was the residence of Edward Seymour's mother, Anne, the Duchess of Somerset. And the reason that they met there was because Catherine's friend Jane, who was Edward's sister, was ill, so she had to leave court, and Catherine accompanied her. To Hanworth, where she essentially had to convalesce, and and Edward Seymour was resident there as well at the same time. And it seems to have been love at first sight, especially on Catherine's part. Um, and then their affair really gained momentum during Elizabeth's reign, and we know that they had a lot of clandestine meetings, and they made plans to marry, which they secretly did in the winter of 1560, which was around 2 years into Elizabeth's reign. So it was really an affair that had been in progress for around 2 years or so by the time that they did eventually marry.
Why did they not seek Elizabeth's permission to marry?
I think the main reason was because they were very much aware that Elizabeth recognised Catherine's dynastic significance, and for that reason would probably not agree to any marriage that was not in her interests, as in Elizabeth's interests, because she was aware of the threat that it would pose to Elizabeth's own status as queen. Um, and I mean, we see this as well with other members of the royal family as well. We see this with Catherine's younger sister Mary, who also married clandestinely and suffered house arrest as a result. So I think Elizabeth was just very um, kind of cautious to the point of wanting to limit her kind of female relatives' marriages because was aware of the political threat it posed. And I think Catherine and Edward were probably very much aware of this, and they knew that if they did try to seek permission, it would be refused. So that's why they just went ahead anyway with their plans and married in secret.
How long were they married for before the marriage was discovered?
So we don't know the exact date of their marriage, but we know that it took place sometime in November or December 1560. And the real problem arose because Catherine conceived a child quite soon after the marriage, and she attempted by all kind of possible means to conceal her pregnancy. But by the summer of 1561, when she was around 8 months with child, and obviously her condition was very visible, when the courts was on the summer progress, she seems to, which again I talk about in the book, she seems to have been aware that, courtiers were noticing that there was gossip about her condition, and she eventually confided in Elizabeth St. Lo, who was also an attendant of the Queen, and Sir Robert Dudley, who was obviously Elizabeth's favourite. I think because she was hoping that they would be able to intercede on her behalf, which obviously any attempt that they made was unsuccessful, and Elizabeth reacted with fury. But what is very interesting as well is Edward Seymour was not actually in the country at this time. He had departed for the continent to kind of do some traveling for a few months. So he was not present with her when all of this was going on. And he had promised to kind of come back and assist her if need be. But when she was writing to him, it eventually got to the point where she stopped receiving responses from him, and I think this court was causing her to have a lot of doubt about whether, he was still committed to her and whether he would be able to help her. So, I think it's possible that she kind of panicked as well, and that's why she confided in Elizabeth St. Lo and Robert Dudley at kind of the time that she did.
What was the fallout from Elizabeth discovering that Catherine had married Edward?
Oh, well, Elizabeth reacted swiftly. She had Catherine arrested and incarcerated in the Tower immediately. And she ordered Edward to return from abroad, where, as I mentioned, he was on the continent at the time. And the minute he kind of arrived back in the country, he was arrested as well and incarcerated in the Tower. And they were both questioned kind of immediately from the point of their imprisonment about everything that had gone on with their relationship, with the marriage. They were asked, virtually every question that could be about when it had taken place, who had married them, who had been present, where it had taken place. The Royal Commissioners were just trying to find out as much as possible about the marriage, kind of to determine whether it was legitimate or not. So that's kind of really what happened that once Elizabeth found out.
Why was Catherine not able to prove that she was married to Edward?
Well, I think they were both very unlucky because it was kind of a set of circumstances that fell into place kind of once they got married. For a start, I mentioned earlier Jane Seymour, who was Edward's sister and who seems to have been something of a best friend to Catherine at court. She had been the only witness present at their wedding. But unfortunately for Catherine and Edward, she died in March 1561, around 3 months or so after the wedding. So she was unable to testify to it taking place and was unable to prove that there had been a wedding. And secondly, the priest who had married them, they were unable to locate him, so he could not be found. Again, was not able to testify that he had married them and that it had taken place. So it was kind of these two circumstances that meant that they essentially had no proof that they were married, and therefore made it very easy for the marriage to be declared invalid as a result of this.
I've read, and I don't know how true this is, that before Edward went on the continent, he left Catherine important belongings and that
Yeah.
she couldn't find them. Is this also true as well?
Yes, it is. Yes, absolutely. So I think again it was kind of a combination of circumstances that made it made it very difficult, if not impossible, for them to prove that they had been married. Especially with, I mean, this is probably a huge oversimplification, but obviously with all of the kind of customs of marriage at the time, with all of the kind of duties that were expected to be fulfilled, with the reading of banns, for example, and obviously none of this had taken place, so they had no evidence of a marriage, and therefore, as I said, it was quite straightforward for their marriage to be declared invalid on this basis.
Was Catherine, would Catherine be forced to give birth in the Tower of London?
Yes, I mean, so she was imprisoned there in August 1561, as I said, very soon after Elizabeth essentially learned of the marriage. And she, as I mentioned earlier, she was heavily pregnant by this time, and she gave birth to the couple's first son, called Edward, on 24th of September 1561. But as kind of a condition of her arrest, she would have had no choice about where she could have given birth, and the birth had to take place there, as it would with her second son as well. So yeah, it probably would not obviously have been her first choice, but yeah, it took place yeah, a month after she was incarcerated there.
Can you tell us how Catherine and Edward managed to meet up during their imprisonment and then have a second child as well?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And as you can imagine, this obviously caused Elizabeth to be incandescent with rage when she found out that her officials had disobeyed her orders to specifically keep the couple apart from each other. So, as I mentioned, Edward was also held in the Tower at the same time as Catherine once he had returned from the continent, but they were kept in separate lodgings. But the couple's jailers seem to have felt sympathy for them. There's something I talk about in the book is the role of kind of public opinion with Catherine's situation during the early 1560s, and there does seem to have been a lot of sympathy for her plight, and the jailers seem to have kind of felt similarly. They seem to have felt sympathetic towards the couple. And as a result of this, they clandestinely allowed them to meet. As I mentioned, with the couple being held in separate lodgings, they needed the jailer's assistance for them to meet. And we know that Edward visited Catherine's rooms on a number of occasions in the spring of 1562, as a result of him bribing the guards to allow him to do so. And this is how Catherine conceived a second child, with their second son Thomas being born in February 1563. So.
When their marriage was publicly denounced as invalid, why were they still imprisoned in the Tower?
Think because I mean that's a really interesting question because yeah, there's a question, isn't there, about whether their marriage having been declared invalid, whether Catherine presented that much of a threat to Elizabeth anymore. But I think all of this coincided with a crisis over the succession, which was compounded by a number of circumstances. Firstly, Elizabeth fell ill with smallpox in October 1562 while the couple was still in the Tower, and her life was despaired of. It was really thought that she was going to die, and her Privy Council were meeting in secret to discuss who was going to succeed. And there was quite a lot of debate about all of this going on. And perhaps as a direct result of this, there were a number of succession tracts during the 1560s debating the succession, in the event that if Elizabeth didn't marry and produce a child, who was going to succeed? Because it had been, I think, a massive shock that, Elizabeth had come so close to death and the succession was still unresolved. So I think for this reason, Elizabeth in particular still regarded Catherine very much as a dynastic threat. And I think this is why we see her react with such fury when she learned that the couple had secretly met and had had another child. And Hertford was fined the exorbitant sum of £10,000, which was a staggering sum of money at the time for meeting with Catherine in secret, although he was subsequently not required to pay the full amount. But it just shows, I think, the extent of Elizabeth's fury. And even when Catherine was released and placed under house arrest, there was no question of her being forgiven and returned to favour as a result of this.
As you just mentioned, obviously, Catherine is moved into house arrest.
Yes. Yeah.
Where was she moved to?
So there was plague in London in the summer of 1563. So as a result of this, Elizabeth ordered both Edward and Catherine to be removed from the Tower, but as I just mentioned, not to be restored to royal favour, but instead to be placed under house arrest. So Catherine and her younger son Thomas were placed in the custody of her uncle, Lord John Grey, at Pergo in Essex, while Edward was taken to his mother's house at Hanworth. Catherine was later held in a number of different residences. She was with her uncle in Pergo for a time, but she was later moved elsewhere. But yes, for the final 5 years of her life, she endured house arrest and was never invited back to court or restored to royal favour.
What do we know of Catherine's, final maybe 1 to 2 years of life?
Well, I think her final years were very traumatic. We still have many handwritten letters by her, currently held in the British Library, and letters written by her uncle, John Grey, as well, in which they were both seeking the intercession of Sir William Cecil and Robert Dudley on Catherine's behalf. And they also wrote to Elizabeth herself, essentially pleading for forgiveness. And Catherine's uncle's letters, in particular, really give an insight into how her psychological and physical um, conditions just completely declined and deteriorated, and how she was essentially refusing to eat, and how she was spending so much time crying and not wanting to leave her bed. And I suppose we would now call this depression, but I think, as kind of the years passed and she realized that she wasn't going to be restored to favor and that she would not be reunited with her husband and her eldest son, her kind of mental condition just completely deteriorated. And she, probably from that perspective, not surprising that she died quite soon after leaving the tower, only a few years after being placed under house arrest as a result of her deterioration.
Do we know what is the official cause of Catherine's death?
Um, some historians speculate that she essentially starved herself to death and maybe developed what we would now call anorexia. But I think it's perhaps more likely that she died just based on the very kind of fragmentary surviving evidence that we have, that she died perhaps of consumption, which we now know as tuberculosis, which was fatal in the 16th century. And yes, probably not surprising from that perspective if she had developed this, that is what resulted in her death.
Do we know where Catherine is buried?
Yes, so she was initially buried at Yoxford Church in Suffolk, which was probably the closest parish church to her final place of house arrest, which was Cockfield Hall. But her grandson, William Seymour, during the 1640s, had Catherine's remains reinterred at Salisbury Cathedral, where she was laid to rest alongside her husband, Edward Seymour. And I think what is interesting is that Edward Seymour actually subsequently remarried twice, but it was Catherine who he chose to be buried alongside, or yeah, or who he was, sorry, I suppose I shouldn't say he chose to be because he was dead by this point, but who he was placed alongside as kind of, I think, a recognition of their a recognition of the fact that their marriage was legitimate and of its kind of political significance as well. And it is possible to still visit today, and they have a spectacular monument, and it's, yeah, definitely worth visiting.
Do we know of public reaction to Catherine's death?
I think regarding Catherine's death, there's very little public evidence of public opinion that I've come across. We know that one of the ambassadors at court reported that Elizabeth kind of expressed sorrow at Catherine's passing, but that he personally doubted it. He believed that she was essentially faking it and that she was, secretly relieved that one of the main dynastic threats to her queenship had been removed. In terms of public opinion, I don't think we have a great deal of evidence for that. But as I mentioned just now, I think with her grandson, William Seymour, having her remains reinterred at Salisbury Cathedral during the 1640s, this kind of perhaps represents a more sympathetic view of Catherine and her marriage to Edward, and a kind of a desire to have it seen to be valid, having been obviously declared invalid during Elizabeth's reign. So perhaps we do see a more sympathetic shift in opinion towards her. And this also touches on the issue of portraits, which I do talk about in the book, the fact that her descendants seem to have continued commissioning portraits of her, I think, to, really honour her memory, but also her kind of dynastic and political significance as well.
What legacy did Catherine leave?
I think probably her main historical legacy would be in her dynastic and political significance. We haven't really talked too much about Henry VIII's last will and testament, which was obviously passed in the mid 1540s. But according to his last will and testament, she was in line to the succession. And if Elizabeth had followed her father's provisions, then it would have been Catherine's eldest son, Edward, who became King of England in 1603, not James VI of Scotland. That obviously being a question of whether Catherine's marriage was accepted as valid and whether Edward Seymour, her son, was legitimate or not. But on the assumption that it would have been accepted as such, then I think it has momentous significance because it did potentially change the course of English history, and we would not have had a Stuart dynasty. It would have instead been a Seymour dynasty. So I think Catherine has a very important historical legacy, and I think what I've really tried to show in the book is that this needs to be more, I think, appreciated and recognised rather than kind of this idea of the inevitability of James succeeding Elizabeth in 1603.
She was truly a remarkable woman, and it's kind of
Yes.
just completely glossed over, isn't it?
Mm. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think everyone's heard of Lady Jane Grey, even people who are just casually interested in history. But it's yeah, not always remembered. I think that she did have two younger sisters as well, and their lives were both as tragic as hers, with both marrying secretly and suffering the consequences of that, house arrest. But I think what has been lost is that they also had a very important dynastic significance, especially Catherine. And I think this does need to be maybe brought more to the forefront.
Towards the end of the podcast, I like to ask my guests five fun history questions. So, firstly, have you got a historical pet peeve?
Um, I think Yeah, I mean, I think probably mine would be with historical drama, whether it's film or TV productions. And I think especially in modern times, we've seen this compared to kind of late 20th century productions, but especially in modern times, I find inaccuracies regarding historical clothing can be really annoying. I think especially probably the main one is when none of the female characters wear headdresses or any kind of head coverings. And you know that that is just so historically inaccurate, and I find it quite jarring as well. So I think that would probably be my main one.
It's so frustrating, isn't it, when they're not
Yes,
accurate?
yeah,
It's,
absolutely, and yeah, modern hairstyles and things like that as well. So,
if you could go back in time to any event or day in history, when would it be and why?
well, as gory as it sounds, I would probably have to say the execution of Anne Boleyn, just based on my current research, and I think because it was so groundbreaking and unprecedented in English history, and I think, as I said, obviously very gory. So I think that side of it would not have been pleasant. But I think just in terms of its historical significance, that day would probably be at the forefront, I think.
No, absolutely. I mean, I don't know if I could
Yeah.
witness it, but I'd like to see
Mm,
like all who's there. And
yes. Mm, yeah, absolutely.
have you got a favorite book? It can be fiction, non-fiction, or both.
Well, I don't have a favorite book per se, but I would say it's not a Tudor book, but I would say I read The Resurrection of the Romanovs a few years ago by Greg King and Penny Wilson, which discusses Anna Anderson's claim to be Anastasia, who was the youngest daughter of Tsar Nicholas II. And it's extremely interesting and exhaustively researched. They spent so many years researching this and researching this woman's claim to be Anastasia, and it's quite shocking in some of its conclusions. I would say that's a really good book that I'd recommend to any kind of history enthusiast, even if it's not their kind of period of specialism.
If you could invite any historical figure to a dinner party, who would it be and why?
Yes, I mean, yeah, this is a tricky question because yeah, there's so many candidates you could choose from, but I think it might have to be Elizabeth Woodville, I think, because of how fascinating and turbulent her life was. And I think she's someone a bit like some of the other figures we've mentioned who has quite a controversial historical reputation. And I think there are a lot of myths around her. So it would be interesting to, see what she was really like. And I think have her perspective on, some of the key episodes of the Wars of the Roses and figures like Richard III, obviously, and Henry VII. So yeah, I would probably say her.
It would be such a good one to have her because you get all the gossip and
Yeah. Mm, absolutely.
and finally, have you got a favourite historical fact?
Um, it may not be a favourite historical fact as such, but I think just based on my current doctoral research, something that I find very interesting and I think can be quite overlooked is the fact that obviously Mary, Queen of Scots, and Charles I were grandmother and grandson, and they were both executed within a period of 60 years. And I think just based on my current research, it's so interesting the ways in which 17th century authors drew links and connections between the two. And yeah, kind of their family or relationship, how that was really drawn upon and yeah, made use of by different authors. So I think that's a really interesting historical fact that, yeah, perhaps people tend to overlook sometimes this kind of double regicide in a period of 60 years. So,
And it's the same dynasty, so it's just like, oh
yes,
dear.
yes, exactly. Yeah, unlucky.
Thank you so much for coming on today, and you've really educated me today about Catherine. I've learned so much today.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me, and thanks for the great questions. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Her Story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.